Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into something that might just change how you think about one of history's darkest chapters. We're talking about life after the Black Death, and I promise you, it's nothing like what you've been told in history class. Picture this. You wake up one morning in the year 1355, and the world around you is eerily quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The plague has finally burned itself out across Europe, leaving behind a continent that's been fundamentally broken and rebuilt in ways nobody saw coming. Half the population is gone, maybe more in some places, and you somehow are still breathing. Now, before we dive into this journey together, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you're into these deep historical dives, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community come together over these stories that shaped our world. So settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's step into a world that's simultaneously more brutal and more hopeful than you might imagine. Because what happened after the Black Death wasn't just recovery. It was revolution, quiet and messy and absolutely fascinating. The first thing you need to understand about post-plague Europe is that everything you thought you knew about medieval life just got thrown out the window. This wasn't some gradual return to normal. Normal was dead and buried in those mass graves. What emerged instead was something entirely new, something that would reshape the entire structure of European society in ways that are still echoing today. Let's start with the basics. Imagine walking through a village in 1350 versus walking through that same village in 1360. The difference is staggering. In 1350, you might have seen bustling streets, crowded markets, people shoulder to shoulder living out their predetermined roles in a rigid social hierarchy. Lords in their castles, peasants in their fields, everyone knowing exactly where they stood in the grand scheme of things. But by 1360, that same village tells a completely different story. Houses stand empty, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. Fields that once fed hundreds now grow wild with weeds and thistles. The local manor might be completely abandoned, its lord long dead and no heir brave enough to claim the cursed inheritance. It's like walking through a world that's been reset to factory settings, except nobody remembered to include the instruction manual. This emptiness created something unprecedented in medieval Europe. Opportunity. For the first time in centuries, there was more land than people to work it. More jobs than workers to fill them. More resources than mouths to feed. And this shift, this fundamental rebalancing of supply and demand, turned the entire social order upside down. Think about it from a surviving peasant's perspective. Before the plague, you were tied to your lord's land by bonds that went back generations. Your grandfather worked this soil, your father worked this soil, and you would work this soil until the day you died, handing over most of your harvest to a lord who might not even know your name. You had no choice, no mobility, no leverage. But suddenly, with half the population gone, you become valuable, not just as a warm body, but as a skilled worker, a decision maker, someone with options. Lords who once wouldn't spare you a glance are now practically begging you to work their lands. They're offering better terms, higher wages, even freedoms that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. This created what historians call the first real labour shortage in European history. And let me tell you, workers figured out pretty quickly how to use that to their advantage. Peasants started walking off estates that treated them poorly and shopping around for better deals. Some even banded together, forming early versions of what we might recognise as labour unions, demanding written contracts and fair compensation. The response from the ruling class was swift and panicked. In England, they passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, basically trying to force wages back to pre-plague levels and make it illegal for workers to seek better employment elsewhere. Similar laws popped up across Europe, all desperately trying to stuff the social mobility genie back into its bottle. But here's the thing about genies. Once they're out, they don't go back in quietly. These laws were largely unenforceable because the economic reality was stronger than any legal decree. If you're a lord with fields full of rotting crops and only 3 peasants left in your entire village, you're going to pay whatever it takes to get those crops harvested, regardless of what some statute says. This shift wasn't just about economics, though. It was about dignity, about self-worth, about the fundamental question of what it means to be human. For generations, the church and the nobility had preached that social hierarchy was divinely ordained. The poor were poor because God wanted them poor, and questioning that order was questioning God himself. But when the plague killed bishops and beggars with equal enthusiasm, when it brought down castles and hovels alike, people started asking some uncomfortable questions. If God really wanted to preserve the social order, why did he let it burn? If the nobility really were chosen by divine right, why were so many of them rotting in unmarked graves alongside the peasants they once ruled? This questioning led to what might be the most significant cultural shift in European history: the slow but steady erosion of the idea that your birth determined your worth. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't universal, but cracks had appeared in the foundation of feudalism that would only grow wider with time. Women, too, found themselves in unprecedented positions. With so many men dead, widows inherited property and businesses they never would have controlled before. Some became surprisingly successful merchants and landowners. Others took on roles in guilds and crafts that had been exclusively male domains for centuries. I came across records of women running breweries, managing farms, even serving as village officials in some areas. This wasn't feminist revolution in any modern sense, but it was practical necessity creating opportunities that challenged long-held assumptions about gender roles. The church, meanwhile, found itself in an identity crisis of epic proportions. The institution that had promised salvation and protection had watched helplessly as its flock was decimated. Entire monasteries were wiped out. Parish priests died alongside their parishioners, and the survivors were left wondering what exactly they'd been paying tithes for all those years. Some people responded by becoming even more devout, seeing the plague as a test of faith or a call to repentance. But others began questioning the church's authority in ways that would have been unthinkable before. If priests couldn't save you from earthly death, what made them qualified to guide you toward eternal life? This skepticism would eventually contribute to some of the most significant religious upheavals in European history. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, what matters is understanding that the plague didn't just kill people. It killed certainties. It killed the idea that the world was stable, predictable, divinely ordered. And into that vacuum of certainty stepped something remarkable: human adaptability. People didn't just survive the aftermath of the Black Death. They improvised, innovated, and ultimately thrived in ways that transformed European society forever. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this transformation was how quietly it happened. There were no grand declarations, no revolutionary manifestos, just millions of individual decisions made by people trying to build better lives in a broken world. A peasant deciding to leave his lord's estate, a widow choosing to run her dead husband's business, a young person learning to read and write because knowledge had suddenly become valuable. These small acts of agency, multiplied across a continent, created changes that were more profound than any war or conquest. They laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the eventual rise of democracy and capitalism. The world we live in today was born in the ruins left by the Black Death. Now, I want to be clear about something. This wasn't some utopian transformation where everyone suddenly became equal and free. The basic structures of medieval society, the monarchy, the nobility, the church, they all survived the plague and continued to wield enormous power. But their monopoly on that power had been broken, and new voices were beginning to demand a seat at the table. The decades following the Black Death were messy, uncertain, often violent. There were peasant uprisings, religious conflicts, political upheavals. But underneath all that chaos was something unprecedented. Ordinary people discovering they had choices and the courage to make them. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen peacefully. By the 1370s and 1380s, the tensions that had been building since the plague finally exploded into open rebellion across Europe. The most famous of these was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, but similar uprisings erupted from France to Germany to the Low Countries. These weren't random acts of violence or mindless destruction. They were coordinated political movements with clear demands and sophisticated strategies. The rebels had learned to organize, to communicate across vast distances, and most importantly, to articulate their grievances in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval authority. Take Wat Tyler, the leader of the English Revolt. This wasn't some wild-eyed radical spouting incomprehensible rhetoric. He was a skilled craftsman who could negotiate with kings and present coherent political demands. When he met with the young King Richard II, he didn't grovel or beg. He negotiated as an equal, demanding the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and the right to buy and sell freely in markets. The revolts were ultimately crushed, of course. The ruling classes still had the military power to suppress open rebellion, but something fundamental had changed. The very fact that peasants could organize on such a scale, could articulate political demands, could force kings to negotiate, proved that the old order was crumbling. And while the rebellions failed in their immediate goals, they succeeded in something perhaps more important. They demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge authority, could envision a different kind of society, could fight for their vision of justice. That lesson wouldn't be forgotten. Meanwhile, something equally revolutionary was happening in the realm of ideas. The massive death toll had created a shortage not just of labourers, but of educated clergy and administrators. Suddenly, there was unprecedented demand for people who could read, write, and keep accounts. Literacy, once the exclusive preserve of the church and nobility, began spreading into the merchant class and even among skilled craftsmen. This explosion in literacy had profound consequences. For the first time in European history, large numbers of ordinary people could access written knowledge directly, without having to rely on clerical interpretation. They could read the Bible in their own languages, study legal documents, correspond with people in distant towns, even write down their own thoughts and experiences. The printing press, invented around 1440, accelerated this trend dramatically. Books that once took months for scribes to copy by hand could now be produced in hundreds or thousands of copies. The price of written knowledge plummeted, making it accessible to people who never could have afforded hand-copied manuscripts. But perhaps more importantly, the printing press democratized the very act of communication. Anyone with something to say could potentially reach a mass audience. Political pamphlets, religious treatises, scientific observations, even bawdy jokes could spread across Europe faster than ever before. The monopoly on information that had been held by church and state was broken forever. This information revolution intersected with profound changes in how people understood their relationship to the divine. The plague had shaken faith in traditional religious authority, and the spread of literacy allowed people to engage with religious questions directly. They could read scripture for themselves, form their own interpretations, even challenge official church doctrine. New religious movements sprouted like wildflowers after rain. Some were mystical, emphasizing direct personal experience of the divine. Others were reformist, calling for the church to return to what they saw as original Christian principles. Still others were revolutionary, rejecting church authority entirely and advocating for radical social change. The church tried to maintain control through censorship and persecution, but the genie was out of the bottle. By the late 1400s, reformers like Jan Hus in Bohemia and John Wycliffe in England were attracting massive followings with their calls for religious renewal. Their ideas would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation, but the groundwork was laid in the spiritual crisis that followed the Black Death. Economic changes were equally dramatic. The labour shortage had given workers unprecedented bargaining power, but it had also forced employers to become more innovative and efficient. Unable to rely on cheap peasant labour, landowners began experimenting with new agricultural techniques, crop rotations, and farming technologies. The result was what historians call the agricultural revolution of the late medieval period. Farms became more productive even as they employed fewer workers. This freed up labour for other activities and created surplus wealth that could be invested in trade, manufacturing, and urban development. Cities began growing again, but they were different from their pre-plague predecessors. The new urban centres were more diverse, more dynamic, more open to innovation and change. Guild restrictions loosened as desperate masters accepted apprentices they would have previously rejected. Women entered trades that had been closed to them. Foreign merchants established permanent communities, bringing new ideas and techniques. This urban renaissance created a new social class that hadn't really existed before the plague, a true middle class of merchants, craftsmen, professionals, and small-scale entrepreneurs. These people weren't nobility, but they weren't peasants either. They owned property, employed workers, influenced local politics, and increasingly, they expected their voices to be heard in matters of governance. The rise of this middle class fundamentally altered European political structures. Kings and nobles could no longer ignore the interests of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen. These people had money, influence, and organization. They could fund armies, control trade routes, and even challenge royal authority when their interests were threatened. City-states like Venice, Florence, and the Hanseatic League cities became major political powers, sometimes rivaling or even surpassing traditional kingdoms in wealth and influence. These urban republics developed new forms of government that gave significant power to merchant councils and guild representatives. It wasn't democracy as we understand it today, but it was a radical departure from the divine right monarchy that had dominated medieval Europe. Trade networks expanded dramatically as well. The combination of urban growth, increased literacy, and technological innovation created demand for goods from across the known world. Spices from Asia, silk from China, gold from Africa, all flowed through European markets in unprecedented quantities. But perhaps most importantly, ideas flowed along these same trade routes. Islamic science and philosophy, ancient Greek texts, preserved in Byzantine libraries, mathematical concepts from India, all found their way into European intellectual circles. This cross-cultural exchange would prove crucial to the intellectual flowering we now call the Renaissance. Speaking of the Renaissance, it's important to understand that this wasn't some sudden eruption of genius that appeared out of nowhere. The Renaissance was built on the foundations laid in the century following the Black Death. The social mobility, the literacy boom, the economic dynamism, the questioning of traditional authority, all of these post-plague developments created the conditions that made Renaissance culture possible. Artists could find patrons among the new merchant class. Scholars could access ancient texts through expanded trade networks. Scientists could challenge religious orthodoxy because authority itself had been weakened. The Renaissance wasn't a rebirth of classical antiquity. It was the birth of something entirely new, forged in the crucible of post-plague transformation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The point is that by the early 1400s, less than a century after the Black Death had seemed to end European civilization, a new world was emerging from the ruins of the old. It was messier, more complex, more uncertain than what had come before, but it was also more dynamic, more innovative, more full of possibility. The transformation wasn't complete, of course. Many aspects of medieval society persisted well into the modern era. Feudalism evolved rather than disappeared. The church adapted rather than collapsed. Monarchy survived by learning to accommodate new sources of power and authority. But the fundamental shift had occurred. The idea that society was fixed and unchanging, that people were bound to the stations they were born into, that authority came exclusively from God and King, these ideas had been fatally weakened. In their place grew the revolutionary notion that human beings could shape their own destinies, that society could be reformed, that progress was possible. This wasn't just an intellectual shift, it was an emotional and psychological transformation. People who had survived the apocalypse and rebuilt their world from scratch had a different relationship to change, to risk, to possibility. They had seen the worst that could happen and discovered they could survive it. More than survive it, they could use it as an opportunity to build something better. The confidence that came from this experience would drive European expansion, exploration, and innovation for centuries to come. The same spirit that led peasants to demand fair wages would eventually lead Columbus to sail west into the unknown, lead Luther to challenge papal authority, lead Galileo to point his telescope at the heavens. The Black Death had tried to end European civilization. Instead, it had transformed it so completely that it became the foundation for the modern world. Not through any grand plan or divine intervention, but through millions of individual acts of courage, creativity, and determination by ordinary people who refused to accept that the end of their world had to mean the end of hope. And that transformation was just getting started. The changes weren't just happening in fields and workshops. They were literally reshaping the landscape of Europe itself. As you travelled through the continent in the late 1300s, you would have witnessed something unprecedented. Entire regions being remapped by human movement on a scale that hadn't been seen since the barbarian migrations centuries earlier. But this wasn't conquest or invasion. This was opportunity in motion. People were voting with their feet, abandoning places that offered them nothing and seeking out communities that promised them something better. It was the world's first great economic migration, driven not by war or famine, but by the radical new idea that you didn't have to die where you were born. Picture a young woman in rural France whose entire family had been wiped out by the plague. In the old world, she would have been stuck, maybe taken in by distant relatives as an unpaid servant, maybe sent to a convent, maybe just left to starve. But in this new reality, she had choices that would have been unimaginable to her grandmother. She could walk to the nearest town and apprentice herself to a weaver, learning a trade that would give her independence and a decent living. She could join one of the groups of migrants heading to depopulated regions where lords were offering free land to anyone willing to work it. She could even, and this was truly revolutionary, choose to remain unmarried and support herself through her own labour. This mobility created a domino effect that transformed European society from the ground up. Villages that had been isolated for centuries suddenly found themselves on major migration routes. Towns that had been sleepy agricultural centres became bustling crossroads where people from dozens of different regions mingled and traded not just goods, but ideas, techniques, and ways of life. Languages began to blur and blend in fascinating ways. A merchant travelling from Flanders to Italy might pick up phrases in a dozen different dialects along the way. Local customs spread far beyond their places of origin, as people carried their traditions with them to new homes. Even something as basic as cooking began to change as recipes and ingredients moved along the migration routes. But perhaps most importantly, this great reshuffling broke down the rigid regional identities that had defined medieval Europe. People began to think of themselves not just as villagers or townspeople, but as members of larger communities defined by trade, religion, or shared interests rather than just geography. The church, meanwhile, was struggling to adapt to this new reality. For centuries, parish boundaries had been as fixed as the stars. People were born, baptized, married, and buried in the same small church their ancestors had attended for generations. But now priests found themselves ministering to constantly changing congregations of strangers from far-off places. Some clergy embraced this challenge, learning new languages and adapting their sermons to speak to diverse audiences. Others retreated into rigid orthodoxy, preaching against the dangers of mixing with foreigners and abandoning traditional ways. This tension within the church would eventually contribute to the religious upheavals of the following centuries. The nobility faced their own crisis of identity. Their power had always been based on controlling specific pieces of land and the people who lived on them. But what good was being the lord of an empty castle when your former subjects were thriving as free farmers 3 kingdoms away? Some nobles adapted by transforming themselves into entrepreneurs, using their remaining resources to fund trading ventures or manufacturing enterprises. Others doubled down on their traditional prerogatives, becoming increasingly desperate and violent in their attempts to maintain control over a world that was slipping away from them. This created a fascinating paradox. As individual nobles grew weaker, monarchy itself often grew stronger. Kings who could adapt to the new reality found themselves with unprecedented opportunities to centralize power. With the old feudal bonds dissolving, rulers could build new forms of loyalty based on shared interest rather than inherited obligation. Smart monarchs began to ally themselves with the emerging merchant class, offering protection and legal framework in exchange for tax revenue and political support. This wasn't the divine right monarchy of earlier centuries, but a more pragmatic form of kingship that recognized the need to negotiate with powerful subjects rather than simply commanding them. The transformation wasn't just political and economic, it was profoundly cultural. Art began to reflect this new reality, moving away from the stylized religious imagery that had dominated medieval culture toward more realistic depictions of everyday life. Painters started including portraits of merchants and craftsmen alongside traditional religious figures, acknowledging that secular success was as worthy of celebration as spiritual achievement. Music, too, began to change. The elaborate polyphonic compositions that had been the domain of cathedral choirs gave way to simpler songs that ordinary people could sing in their homes and workshops. Traveling musicians carried popular tunes from region to region, creating the first truly pan-European musical culture. Literature experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation. For the first time, writers began composing major works in local languages rather than Latin, making sophisticated literature accessible to anyone who could read their native tongue. These vernacular texts often dealt with contemporary concerns rather than classical or religious themes, reflecting the growing confidence of ordinary people that their own experiences were worthy of artistic treatment. But the most profound change was in how people thought about time itself. Medieval culture had been fundamentally backward-looking, seeing the present as a fallen state compared to some golden age in the past. The plague survivors, however, had lived through the ultimate catastrophe and emerged to build something better. For the first time in European history, people began to believe that the future might be superior to the past. This shift in temporal perspective was revolutionary. It meant that innovation became valuable rather than suspicious, that change could be seen as progress rather than decay. Young people no longer automatically deferred to their elders' wisdom, because the elders' world had literally ended. New ideas, new techniques, new ways of organizing society all became legitimate subjects for experimentation. The effects rippled through every aspect of life. Farmers began experimenting with new crops and techniques rather than simply following traditional practices. Craftsmen developed new tools and methods without worrying about violating ancient guild traditions. Even in religion, people became more willing to consider new interpretations of scripture rather than simply accepting established doctrine. This experimental attitude created a feedback loop of innovation that would drive European development for centuries. Each successful change encouraged further experimentation, while the memory of having survived and thrived through massive disruption made people more willing to take risks. The population gradually began to recover, but the new Europe that emerged was fundamentally different from what had existed before the plague. Cities grew larger and more diverse than their medieval predecessors. Rural areas were more productive and less rigidly hierarchical. Trade networks stretched further and carried more varied goods. Most importantly, social mobility became a permanent feature of European life rather than a rare exception. By the early 1400s, less than 2 generations after the plague's end, Europe had not just recovered, but had become something entirely new. The foundations were laid for everything that would follow: the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, even the eventual development of democratic government and capitalist economics. None of this was planned or foreseen. It emerged organically from millions of individual decisions made by people trying to build better lives in a disrupted world. A peasant choosing to learn a trade, a merchant deciding to invest in new technology, a scholar questioning traditional authority, a young person leaving home to seek opportunity elsewhere. These small acts of agency, multiplied across a continent and accumulated over decades, created changes more profound than any war or conquest. They demonstrated that ordinary people, given opportunity and necessity, could reshape civilization itself. The Black Death had seemed like the end of the world. Instead, it became the beginning of the modern world, not through any grand design, but through the simple human refusal to accept that catastrophe must mean defeat. In the ruins of medieval certainty, Europeans built something unprecedented, a society based on the radical idea that things could always be made better, and they were just getting started. The energy unleashed by this great transformation would soon propel European explorers across unknown oceans, European thinkers toward revolutionary new ideas about science and government, and European societies toward forms of organization that would eventually spread across the globe. But that's a story for another time. What matters for now is understanding that the world we inhabit today, with all its possibilities and problems, was born in those crucial decades when plague survivors looked around at their broken world and decided to rebuild it better than before. The transformation was far from complete, and it certainly wasn't without its dark sides. The same energy that drove innovation and social mobility also fueled conquest and exploitation. The same questioning of authority that led to religious reform also contributed to religious warfare. The same economic dynamism that created new opportunities also generated new forms of inequality. But the fundamental shift had occurred. Europeans had learned that they could change their world, and that knowledge would drive everything that followed. The age of accepting things as they were had ended. The age of making things as they should be had begun. The ripple effects of this transformation touched every corner of daily existence in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Walking through a European town in the early 1400s was like stepping into a completely different civilization, one where the very air seemed to hum with possibility and change. Take something as simple as what people wore. Before the plague, clothing had been one of the most rigid markers of social status. Peasants wore rough brown wool, merchants wore slightly better brown wool, and only the nobility could afford the luxury of colours and fine fabrics. Sumptuary laws strictly regulated who could wear what, ensuring that a person's social rank was immediately visible to everyone around them. But in the post-plague world, these boundaries began to blur in fascinating ways. Successful craftsmen started wearing brightly coloured tunics that would have gotten them arrested a generation earlier. Widows who had inherited their husbands' businesses adorned themselves with jewellery and silk scarves that proclaimed their new status as independent economic actors. Even former peasants, who had prospered as free farmers, began to dress in ways that reflected their improved circumstances. The authorities tried to maintain the old clothing laws, but enforcement became increasingly difficult and ultimately futile. When a blacksmith could afford better clothing than a minor noble, when a female merchant dressed more elegantly than a knight's wife, the visual markers of the old hierarchy simply stopped making sense. Fashion became a form of social mobility, a way for people to literally wear their success on their sleeves. This wasn't just vanity or showing off, though there was certainly some of that. Clothing had become a language, a way of communicating your place in the new social order to a world where traditional markers of status were rapidly losing their meaning. A well-dressed merchant could command respect and trust from customers who might have dismissed a raggedly clothed peasant. A woman in fine garments could move through society with a confidence and authority that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. The changes went deeper than mere appearances, though. The very rhythm of daily life had been fundamentally altered by the demographic catastrophe and its aftermath. In the old world, time had moved according to ancient patterns: the agricultural cycle, the church calendar, the unchanging routine of feudal obligations. Life was predictable, if not always pleasant. But the post-plague world operated on a different temporal logic entirely. Markets opened and closed based on the arrival of travelling merchants rather than traditional schedules. Workshops operated according to demand rather than custom. Even religious observances became more flexible as priests adapted to serve communities that no longer fit traditional parish boundaries. This acceleration of life created new forms of stress, but also new opportunities for those quick enough to seize them. A craftsman who could adapt his production schedule to meet sudden demand for his goods might find himself wealthy beyond his ancestors' dreams. A farmer who could time his harvest to coincide with merchant caravans could command premium prices for his crops. The concept of individual career planning, almost unknown in medieval society, began to emerge as people realized they could actively shape their economic destinies. Young people started making strategic decisions about which trades to enter, which regions offered the best opportunities, even which languages to learn based on trade patterns and market demands. Education, once the exclusive preserve of the clergy and nobility, became increasingly practical and widespread. Parents who had never learned to read began scraping together money to send their children to schools that taught not just Latin and theology, but mathematics, accounting, and the vernacular literacy skills needed for commercial success. These new schools were often cramped, poorly equipped affairs, run by itinerant teachers who moved from town to town. But they represented something revolutionary: the idea that knowledge was a commodity that ordinary people could purchase to improve their circumstances. A farmer's son who learned to keep accounts might become a merchant. A craftsman's daughter who mastered reading and writing might manage her own business, rather than simply inheriting her husband's trade. The explosion in practical literacy had profound consequences for how information moved through society. Before the plague, news and knowledge had flowed primarily through official channels: royal proclamations, church sermons, the oral traditions passed down through guilds and families. But as more people gained the ability to read and write, informal networks of communication began to emerge. Merchants corresponded with colleagues in distant cities, sharing information about market conditions, political developments, and technological innovations. Craftsmen exchanged letters describing new techniques and tools. Even ordinary farmers began to keep written records of weather patterns, crop yields, and soil conditions, creating the first systematic agricultural knowledge base in European history. This democratization of information had political implications that the ruling classes were slow to recognize. When only a tiny elite could read and write, controlling information was relatively simple. But when tens of thousands of people across Europe were literate and in regular correspondence with each other, new ideas could spread faster than any authority could suppress them. Religious reformers discovered they could bypass church censorship by writing in vernacular languages and distributing their works through merchant networks. Political dissidents found they could coordinate resistance movements across vast distances through coded letters and pamphlets. Even scientific observations and discoveries began to circulate through informal scholarly networks that operated independently of traditional institutional authorities. The printing press, invented in the mid-1400s, would eventually accelerate these trends dramatically. But even before Gutenberg's innovation, the groundwork had been laid by the post-plague literacy boom and the communication networks it created. Europe was becoming an information society centuries before anyone had coined that term. Meanwhile, the physical landscape of Europe was being reshaped by human activity on an unprecedented scale. The massive population loss had initially left vast areas of farmland abandoned and reverting to wilderness. But as the economy recovered and new agricultural techniques spread, people began to reclaim and improve this land in systematic ways. Forest clearance accelerated as communities needed timber for construction and fuel for the growing number of workshops and small industries. Marshes were drained to create new farmland. Rivers were diverted to power mills and workshops. The European countryside began to take on the intensively managed appearance that would characterize it for centuries to come. This environmental transformation wasn't just about exploitation, though. The post-plague survivors had learned hard lessons about the importance of sustainable resource management. Communities that had survived by carefully husbanding their depleted resources during the worst years developed conservation practices that would serve them well as populations recovered. Crop rotation became more sophisticated as farmers experimented with different combinations of grains, legumes, and fallow periods to maintain soil fertility. Animal husbandry improved as selective breeding techniques spread through the informal networks of communication that connected rural communities across Europe. Even forest management became more scientific as communities learned to balance their need for timber with the long-term health of woodland ecosystems. Urban environments were changing even more dramatically. The cities that emerged from the post-plague recovery were unlike anything Europe had seen before. They were larger, more diverse, and more economically dynamic than their medieval predecessors, but they were also more carefully planned and better organized. City governments, many of them newly empowered by the decline of feudal authority, began to invest in infrastructure projects that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. Public fountains provided clean water to residents. Paved streets replaced muddy tracks. Public buildings housed markets, courts, and administrative offices that served the needs of increasingly complex urban economies. Sanitation improved as city leaders recognized the connection between public health and economic prosperity. Waste disposal systems, while still primitive by modern standards, became more organized and effective. Building codes emerged to reduce fire hazards and prevent overcrowding. Some cities even began to regulate air quality by restricting certain types of industrial activity within city limits. These improvements weren't driven by abstract ideals of public welfare, but by practical recognition that healthy, well-organized cities attracted more residents, more trade, and more wealth. Urban governance became increasingly sophisticated as city leaders learned to balance the competing interests of different economic groups, while maintaining the infrastructure and services that made urban life possible. The rise of urban culture also created new forms of entertainment and social interaction. Public festivals became more elaborate and frequent as communities used celebration to reinforce social bonds and display their prosperity. Theatre troupes travelled from city to city, performing plays that dealt with contemporary themes rather than just classical or religious subjects. Music evolved from the formal liturgical compositions of the medieval period toward more popular forms that ordinary people could enjoy and participate in. Taverns became centres of social life, where people from different trades and backgrounds could mingle and exchange ideas. Even games and sports became more organised and widespread as leisure time increased for those who had prospered in the new economy. But perhaps the most significant cultural change was in attitudes toward the future. Medieval culture had been fundamentally pessimistic, viewing history as a decline from some past golden age toward an inevitable apocalypse. The plague survivors, however, had lived through what seemed like the end of the world and discovered that new beginnings were possible. This shift toward optimism about the future became one of the defining characteristics of the emerging Renaissance culture. People began to believe that human effort and ingenuity could create a better world, not just preserve what remained of past greatness. Progress became a possibility rather than a fantasy, and innovation became a virtue rather than a dangerous deviation from tradition. Young people, in particular, embraced this new outlook with enthusiasm. Rather than simply accepting the roles their parents had played, they began to envision different futures for themselves. A blacksmith's son might dream of becoming a merchant prince. A farmer's daughter might imagine running her own workshop. These weren't just idle fantasies anymore, but realistic goals that could be achieved through talent, hard work, and strategic thinking. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. For the first time in European history, large numbers of ordinary people believed they had agency over their own lives. This wasn't the modern concept of individual rights or personal fulfillment, but it was the beginning of the idea that human beings could shape their own destinies rather than simply accepting whatever fate the circumstances of their birth had decreed. This new sense of personal agency intersected with the broader social and economic changes to create a feedback loop of innovation and progress. People who believed they could improve their circumstances were more likely to take the risks necessary for economic advancement. Communities that embraced change were more likely to prosper and attract new residents. Regions that encouraged innovation became centers of learning and development that drew talent from across Europe. The transformation wasn't uniform or immediate. Many areas remained largely unchanged for decades after the plague, clinging to traditional ways of life and social structures. Some regions experienced violent resistance to change as entrenched elites fought to maintain their privileges. Political and religious authorities worked to contain and control the forces they had unleashed, but the momentum of change had become unstoppable. Each successful innovation encouraged further experimentation. Each person who rose above their birth circumstances inspired others to attempt the same journey. Each community that prospered through adaptation attracted imitators who wanted to share in that success. By the early 1400s, Europe had become a laboratory of social, economic, and cultural experimentation on a scale that the world had never seen. The rigid hierarchies and fixed traditions of medieval society were giving way to something more fluid, more dynamic, and ultimately more creative. The foundations had been laid for everything that would follow. The Renaissance flowering of art and learning, the age of exploration that would carry European influence across the globe, and the scientific and political revolutions that would reshape human civilization. None of this had been planned or foreseen by the plague survivors who had simply been trying to rebuild their shattered world, but their practical decisions, made day by day and year by year, in response to immediate needs and opportunities, had created the conditions for one of the most significant transformations in human history. The Black Death had indeed ended one world, but from its ashes, ordinary people had built another world, one that would prove to be far more dynamic and creative than anything that had come before, and they had done it not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through the simple, stubborn determination to make tomorrow better than today. The revolution was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. The energy and creativity unleashed by the post-plague transformation would continue to drive European development for centuries, ultimately creating the modern world we inhabit today. But that transformation had started here, in the decades immediately following history's greatest catastrophe, when survivors looked around at their broken world and decided to build something better. The changes weren't just happening in the grand halls of power or the bustling marketplaces. They were seeping into the most intimate corners of human experience, transforming how people fell in love, raised children, and understood their place in the cosmic order. Walking through a village in the 1380s, you'd witness something that would have scandalized earlier generations: young people choosing their own marriage partners. Before the plague, marriage had been primarily an economic transaction between families, a way to consolidate property, forge political alliances, or simply ensure survival in a harsh world. Love, if it existed at all, was expected to develop after the wedding ceremony, not before. But the demographic catastrophe had disrupted these traditional arrangements in profound ways. With so many families destroyed or scattered, the elaborate networks of kinship that had once arranged marriages simply no longer existed. Young people found themselves with unprecedented freedom to choose their own partners, and they began to exercise that freedom in ways that would reshape European culture for centuries to come. This wasn't just about romance, though there was certainly more of that. It was about the fundamental question of who controlled the most important decisions in a person's life. A young woman who could support herself through her own labor no longer had to accept whatever marriage her family arranged. A craftsman who had built his own business could afford to wait for a partner who shared his ambitions, rather than simply accepting the first available match. The church initially resisted these changes, preaching against the dangers of passionate love and the importance of family authority in marriage decisions. But even religious authorities gradually adapted to the new reality. Parish records from this period show increasing numbers of marriages performed without extensive family involvement, suggesting that priests were willing to bless unions based on the couple's own consent rather than parental approval. This shift toward companionate marriage had ripple effects that extended far beyond individual relationships. Children born to couples who had chosen each other often grew up in households with different dynamics than their parents had experienced. There was more emotional intimacy, more discussion of feelings and desires, more emphasis on individual happiness as a legitimate goal rather than just survival and duty. The way people raised children began to change as well. In the old world, childhood had been brief and harsh. Children were expected to contribute to family survival from an early age, and their individual personalities and preferences were largely irrelevant. But in the post-plague world, where labor was valuable and opportunities were expanding, parents began to invest more heavily in their children's futures. Education became a priority for families who had never before considered it accessible or necessary. A merchant who had prospered through his own literacy might scrimp and save to send his daughter to a school that would teach her to read and calculate. A craftsman who had built his business through innovation might apprentice his son to a master in a distant city, where the boy could learn advanced techniques. This investment in human development created a positive feedback loop that accelerated social mobility across generations. Children who received better education and training often surpassed their parents' achievements, creating wealth and opportunities that they could then pass on to their own offspring. Within a few generations, families could rise from peasant origins to positions of considerable influence and prosperity. The concept of childhood itself began to evolve. Rather than seeing children simply as small adults who needed to be quickly trained for productive labor, parents started to recognize childhood as a distinct phase of life with its own needs and characteristics. Toys became more common and elaborate. Games and stories designed specifically for children began to appear. Even clothing styles differentiated more clearly between adult and child garments. This wasn't a universal transformation, and it certainly wasn't immediate. Many families still lived on the edge of survival and couldn't afford the luxury of extended childhood or expensive education. But the trend was clear and accelerating. European society was beginning to value human potential in ways that would have seemed absurd to earlier generations. Women, in particular, found their roles expanding in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and capability. The plague had created so many widows that society had been forced to accept female economic independence as a practical necessity. But by the late 1300s, even married women were beginning to claim larger roles in family businesses and community affairs. Guild records from this period show increasing numbers of women listed as craftspeople, merchants, and even workshop owners. Some had inherited these positions from dead husbands, but others had earned them through their own skills and efforts. A few exceptional women even founded new businesses or pioneered innovative techniques that brought them recognition far beyond their local communities. The legal system gradually adapted to these changes, though often reluctantly and incompletely. Courts began to recognize women's property rights more consistently. Marriage contracts started to include provisions that protected wives' economic interests. Some cities even allowed women to represent themselves in legal proceedings, rather than requiring male guardians to speak for them. Religious life, too, was being transformed by the changing role of women. Convents that had survived the plague found themselves with unprecedented influence as centers of learning and economic activity. Some abbesses wielded power that rivaled that of bishops or secular lords. Female mystics and religious reformers attracted followings that crossed traditional boundaries of class and region. But perhaps the most significant change was in how women thought about themselves and their possibilities. A generation of women who had survived catastrophe and rebuilt their lives from nothing had developed a confidence and independence that they passed on to their daughters. Young women began to envision futures that extended beyond marriage and motherhood, even as they continued to value those traditional roles. The transformation wasn't limited to gender relations. The plague had also disrupted traditional patterns of aging and generational authority. In the old world, elderly people had been repositories of wisdom and experience, their authority based on their knowledge of traditional ways of doing things. But when the traditional world had literally ended, that knowledge became less valuable than the ability to adapt and innovate. Young adults who had come of age during or after the plague often found themselves in positions of authority over their elders. They were the ones who understood the new economic realities, who had the energy and flexibility to take advantage of emerging opportunities, who could navigate the complex social changes that were reshaping European society. This inversion of traditional age hierarchies created tensions within families and communities, but it also unleashed tremendous creative energy. Young people who might have spent decades deferring to their elders' wisdom were instead encouraged to experiment, innovate, and push boundaries. The result was an explosion of technological, artistic, and intellectual achievement that would have been impossible under the rigid gerontocracy of medieval society. Technology, in particular, benefited from this generational shift. Young craftsmen and inventors were more willing to experiment with new materials, techniques, and tools. They were less bound by guild traditions and more responsive to market demands for improved products. The period following the Black Death saw remarkable innovations in everything from agricultural implements to textile production to mechanical devices. The famous mechanical clocks that began to appear in European cities during this period were just one example of this technological flowering. These complex machines required skills and knowledge that crossed traditional craft boundaries, forcing clockmakers to collaborate with metalworkers, mathematicians, and even astronomers. The result was not just more accurate timekeeping, but a new understanding of precision engineering that would influence countless other fields. Agricultural innovation accelerated as well. Farmers began to experiment with new crops brought back by merchants from distant lands. Root vegetables, new varieties of grains, even exotic spices were introduced to European agriculture. Crop rotation systems became more sophisticated as farmers learned to balance soil fertility with market demands for different products. The three-field system that had dominated medieval agriculture gradually gave way to more complex rotations that could support larger populations while maintaining soil health. Some regions even began to specialize in particular crops, trading their surplus for products they could not efficiently produce themselves. This regional specialization created the foundation for the commercial agriculture that would later fuel European population growth and urban development. Transportation improvements accompanied these agricultural and technological advances. Roads that had fallen into disrepair during the plague years were rebuilt and expanded as trade resumed. Bridges were constructed or repaired to facilitate the movement of goods and people. Even river transport was improved as communities dredged channels and built better docking facilities. The psychological impact of these infrastructure improvements cannot be overstated. Good roads and bridges weren't just practical necessities. They were symbols of confidence in the future, investments in prosperity that might not pay off for years or even decades. Communities that undertook such projects were declaring their belief that better times lay ahead, that the catastrophe of the plague was behind them rather than ahead of them. This optimism about the future became one of the defining characteristics of post-plague European culture. People began to plan for long-term goals in ways that would have seemed foolish during the crisis years. Merchants invested in trading ventures that might not show profits for years. Craftsmen developed skills that would only be valuable if their industries continued to grow. Families saved money for their children's education, even when their own needs were still barely met. The concept of progress, almost unknown in medieval thought, began to emerge as people observed that their own efforts could indeed make life better. Each successful innovation encouraged others to attempt their own improvements. Each family that rose in social status proved that advancement was possible. Each community that prospered through hard work and good planning demonstrated that human effort could triumph over circumstance. This wasn't the modern idea of inevitable progress driven by scientific advancement and technological development. It was something more modest, but perhaps more powerful. The simple recognition that things could be made better through human effort and intelligence. That recognition would prove to be one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. The Church struggled to adapt to this new optimism about earthly life. Medieval Christianity had emphasized the temporary and ultimately illusory nature of worldly success, urging believers to focus on eternal salvation rather than temporal improvement. But when people could see their own lives improving through their own efforts, that message became harder to accept. Some clergy adapted by reinterpreting Christian doctrine to accommodate the new realities. They preached that God blessed those who used their talents wisely, that prosperity could be a sign of divine favor rather than spiritual danger. Others doubled down on traditional teachings about the vanity of worldly success, but found their audiences increasingly skeptical. This tension within Christianity would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation, but its roots can be traced back to the practical optimism that emerged from the post-plague recovery. When people could see that their own efforts made a difference in their earthly lives, they began to question religious authorities who told them that such efforts were meaningless in the cosmic scheme of things. The visual arts began to reflect these changing attitudes as well. Medieval art had been dominated by religious themes depicted in stylized, symbolic ways that emphasized spiritual rather than earthly realities. But post-plague artists began to experiment with more realistic representations of contemporary life, often including portraits of ordinary people alongside traditional religious figures. These artistic innovations weren't just aesthetic choices. They were statements about the value and dignity of ordinary human experience. When a painter included a merchant or craftsman in a religious scene, he was asserting that secular life was worthy of artistic attention. When an artist painted a landscape or cityscape with careful attention to realistic detail, she was celebrating the beauty and importance of the material world. Architecture, too, began to change as communities invested in buildings that served secular rather than purely religious purposes. Town halls, market buildings, and guild halls were constructed with the same care and attention to beauty that had previously been reserved for churches and monasteries. These structures announced that civic life was as worthy of magnificent architecture as religious devotion. The cumulative effect of all these changes was to create a society that was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the Black Death. It wasn't just that people were wealthier or more mobile, though both of those things were true. It was that they had developed a completely different understanding of what human life could and should be. Medieval culture had emphasized acceptance, hierarchy, and resignation to divine will. Post-plague culture increasingly emphasized agency, opportunity, and the possibility of improvement. This wasn't a rejection of religion or traditional values, but a rebalancing that gave greater weight to human potential and earthly achievement. The long-term consequences of this cultural transformation would be enormous. The Renaissance flowering of art and learning, the age of exploration that would carry European influence across the globe, the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding of the natural world, the political revolutions that would create modern democratic government. All of these developments grew from seeds planted during the post-plague recovery. But those grand historical movements were still in the future. For now, what mattered was that ordinary Europeans had discovered something extraordinary. They could change their world. That discovery would drive everything that followed, creating a momentum for change and improvement that would reshape not just Europe, but eventually the entire planet. The transformation was far from complete, and it certainly wasn't without its problems and contradictions. The same energy that drove innovation and social mobility also created new forms of inequality and exploitation. The same questioning of authority that led to beneficial reforms also contributed to political instability and religious warfare. The same optimism about human potential that inspired great achievements also justified conquest and colonization of other peoples. But the fundamental shift had occurred. Europeans had learned that they were not passive victims of fate, but active agents who could shape their own destinies. That lesson, learned in the crucible of post-plague recovery, would echo through the centuries and ultimately transform the world. The transformation wasn't just reshaping individual lives or even entire communities. It was quietly revolutionizing the very foundations of European civilization in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. By the 1400s, you could walk into virtually any major city and witness something that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Ordinary people making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. Take the emergence of what we might recognize as the first true corporations. Merchant guilds that had once been simple trade associations were evolving into complex financial entities capable of funding massive undertakings. The Hanseatic League, for instance, had grown from a loose confederation of trading towns into something approaching a commercial empire with its own fleets, diplomatic corps, and even military forces. These weren't just bigger versions of medieval trading companies. They represented a fundamentally new way of organizing human economic activity. Instead of relying on personal relationships and feudal obligations, they operated according to written contracts, standardized procedures, and rational calculation of profit and loss. Risk was shared among multiple investors, rather than borne by individual merchants, allowing for much larger and more ambitious ventures. The psychological shift this represented was enormous. Medieval economic thinking had been dominated by concepts of just price and moral obligation. Profit was often seen as sinful, and lending money for interest was condemned as usury. But the post-plague economy increasingly operated according to market principles, where price was determined by supply and demand, and profit was seen as the natural reward for successful enterprise. This didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without resistance. Church authorities continued to preach against excessive profit-seeking, and many people remained uncomfortable with purely commercial relationships. But practical necessity gradually overcame moral qualms. When choosing between economic prosperity and abstract ethical principles, more and more Europeans chose prosperity. The rise of banking illustrates this transformation perfectly. Before the plague, most financial transactions had been personal arrangements between individuals who knew each other well. But as trade expanded and became more complex, the need for professional financial services grew beyond what personal relationships could provide. The Medici Bank, founded in the early 1400s, became the template for modern banking by treating money as a commodity like any other. They developed sophisticated techniques for managing risk, transferring funds across long distances, and calculating interest rates. Most importantly, they divorced financial relationships from personal ones, creating the foundation for the impersonal market relationships that would dominate capitalist economies. But the changes went far deeper than new business practices. The entire European understanding of value was being transformed. Medieval culture had distinguished sharply between things that had intrinsic worth, like gold or land, and things that were merely useful, like tools or manufactured goods. But the post-plague economy increasingly treated everything as a commodity, with a market price determined by supply and demand. This commodification of value extended even to human labor. The old feudal system had bound peasants to the land through personal relationships and customary obligations. But the labor shortage created by the plague forced employers to compete for workers by offering wages, creating the first true labor markets in European history. Workers quickly learned to exploit these market conditions. They began to think strategically about their skills, investing time in learning techniques that would make them more valuable. They moved from job to job in search of better wages and working conditions. Some even began to specialize in particular skills, becoming the first professional craftsmen in the modern sense. The nobility watched these developments with growing alarm. Their power had always been based on controlling land and the people who worked it. But when peasants could simply walk away and find better opportunities elsewhere, that control evaporated. Some nobles adapted by becoming entrepreneurs themselves, using their remaining resources to invest in trade and manufacturing. Others retreated into nostalgia, clinging to traditional privileges that were becoming increasingly meaningless. This economic revolution was accompanied by equally profound changes in how Europeans thought about time and space. Medieval culture had operated according to natural rhythms: sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, the cycle of religious festivals. But commercial activity required more precise coordination, leading to the development of mechanical clocks and standardized schedules. The first public clocks appeared in Italian cities during this period, and their impact was revolutionary. For the first time, entire communities could coordinate their activities according to abstract time rather than natural cues. Workshops could operate on regular schedules. Markets could open and close at predetermined times. Even religious services began to follow clock time rather than the traditional canonical hours based on the sun's position. This mechanization of time was more than just a practical convenience. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to the natural world. Instead of living within natural cycles, people began to impose artificial rhythms that served economic rather than biological needs. Work became something that happened at specific times in specific places, rather than a seamless part of daily life. The psychological effects of this temporal revolution were profound. People began to think of time as a resource that could be saved, spent, or wasted. The phrase "time is money" didn't exist yet, but the concept was already taking root. Efficiency became a virtue, and productivity became a measure of personal worth. Spatial relationships were changing just as dramatically. Medieval Europe had been organized around local communities that were largely self-sufficient. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, and their mental maps of the world were correspondingly limited. But the post-plague economy required coordination across much larger distances, forcing Europeans to develop new ways of thinking about geography and space. Maps became more accurate and detailed as merchants needed precise information about routes, distances, and destinations. The Portolan charts developed by Mediterranean sailors represented a quantum leap in geographical knowledge, showing coastlines and harbours with unprecedented accuracy. These weren't just navigational tools, but symbols of a new understanding of space as something that could be measured, mapped, and conquered through human intelligence. The expansion of geographical knowledge was accompanied by an explosion in travel literature. Merchants, diplomats, and adventurers began writing detailed accounts of their journeys, describing foreign lands and peoples with the systematic attention to detail that would later characterize scientific observation. These accounts circulated widely, creating a shared European knowledge base about the wider world. Marco Polo's account of his travels to China, written in the late 13th century, became incredibly popular during this period, not just as entertainment, but as practical information about trading opportunities. Similarly, the travels of Ibn Battuta and other Muslim explorers were translated into European languages, providing detailed information about Africa, Asia, and the Indian Ocean trading networks. This geographical expansion of European consciousness had profound psychological effects. People who had once thought of their village as the center of the universe began to see it as one small part of a vast and complex world full of opportunities and dangers. The mental horizons that had confined medieval Europeans were rapidly expanding, creating both excitement and anxiety about what lay beyond the familiar. The Church struggled to maintain its role as the primary interpreter of this expanding world. Medieval Christianity had developed elaborate systems for understanding the cosmos, placing Earth at the center of a divinely ordered universe, with clear hierarchies extending from God down through the angels to earthly rulers and finally to common people. But as Europeans learned more about distant lands and peoples, this neat cosmological order became harder to maintain. The discovery that prosperous and sophisticated civilizations existed in Asia and Africa, many of them non-Christian, challenged fundamental assumptions about European and Christian superiority. If God favored Christians, why were Muslim and Buddhist societies often wealthier and more advanced than Christian ones? If Europe was the center of divine attention, why did so much of the world seem to get along perfectly well without European influence? These questions didn't immediately lead to religious skepticism, but they did encourage more flexible and pragmatic approaches to faith. European Christians began to develop more nuanced understandings of divine providence that could accommodate the obvious prosperity and sophistication of non-Christian societies. Some even began to argue that God worked through all peoples, not just Christians, to accomplish his purposes in the world. The expansion of European consciousness was facilitated by improvements in communication technology. The printing press, invented in the 1440s, made it possible to disseminate information more rapidly and accurately than ever before. But even before printing, European scribes had developed more efficient methods for copying and distributing manuscripts. Paper, introduced from the Islamic world, was much cheaper than parchment made from animal skins, making books more affordable for ordinary people. Improved inks and writing instruments made copying faster and more legible. Even binding techniques improved, creating books that were more durable and portable than their medieval predecessors. The cumulative effect of these technological improvements was to create the first mass information networks in European history. Ideas, discoveries, and innovations could spread across the continent in months rather than decades. A technological innovation developed in one city could be adopted and improved in dozens of others within a few years. Scientific observations made in one region could be verified and extended by investigators hundreds of miles away. This acceleration of information exchange created feedback loops that drove further innovation. Inventors and scholars who might have worked in isolation now found themselves part of informal networks that spanned the continent. Competitive pressures encouraged rapid development and improvement of new ideas. The pace of change, already accelerated by the social and economic transformations following the plague, continued to increase. By the mid-1400s, European society had developed what we might recognize as the first research and development culture. Systematic experimentation was becoming common not just in natural philosophy, but in practical fields like metallurgy, agriculture, and manufacturing. The trial and error methods that had dominated medieval technology were giving way to more systematic approaches based on careful observation and measurement. This proto-scientific approach wasn't limited to technical fields. European merchants were developing increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing markets, calculating risks, and predicting trends. Military engineers were applying mathematical principles to fortress design and artillery deployment. Even artists were experimenting with perspective, anatomy, and optics in ways that reflected systematic investigation rather than traditional craftsmanship. The intellectual foundations were being laid for what would become the scientific revolution, but the immediate impact was felt in practical applications that improved daily life for ordinary Europeans. Better agricultural techniques increased food production. Improved manufacturing methods made goods cheaper and more widely available. More efficient transportation reduced the cost of trade and communication. The standard of living for ordinary Europeans was rising for the first time in centuries, not just for a privileged elite, but for broad segments of the population. This material improvement reinforced the optimistic attitudes that had emerged from the post-plague recovery, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of improvement and innovation. But the transformation wasn't uniform or uncontested. Many regions remained largely untouched by these changes, clinging to traditional ways of life and social organization. Some groups actively resisted the new developments, seeing them as threats to established order and cherished values. Political and religious authorities worked to channel and control the forces of change, often with mixed success. The tension between innovation and tradition created a dynamic instability that would characterize European culture for centuries. Each generation had to negotiate between inherited customs and emerging possibilities, between the security of familiar ways and the excitement of new opportunities. This ongoing negotiation between past and future became one of the defining characteristics of European civilization. The changes were also creating new forms of inequality and social tension. While some people prospered dramatically from the new opportunities, others found themselves left behind by developments they couldn't understand or control. The gap between winners and losers in the new economy was often larger than the differences between social classes in the old feudal system. Urban areas, in particular, were becoming more stratified as successful merchants and craftsmen accumulated wealth and power that dwarfed the resources of traditional nobles. These new elites didn't just want economic success, they wanted social recognition and political influence to match their financial achievements. Their demands for status and authority would eventually challenge the fundamental assumptions of European political organization. Rural areas experienced different but equally profound changes. The consolidation of agricultural holdings into larger, more efficient units displaced many small farmers, forcing them to seek work in towns and cities. This rural to urban migration accelerated the growth of European cities and created the first industrial workforces. Though large-scale industry was still centuries in the future, the environmental consequences of these changes were becoming visible as well. Deforestation accelerated as growing populations demanded more fuel and building materials. Rivers and harbours were modified to accommodate increased shipping traffic. Mining expanded to meet demands for metals used in everything from coins to weapons to tools. Europeans were beginning to reshape their physical environment on a scale that would have been unimaginable in the medieval period. This wasn't yet the massive environmental transformation of the industrial age, but it represented the beginning of a new relationship between humans and nature based on systematic exploitation rather than subsistence adaptation. The psychological impact of this environmental mastery was significant. Europeans began to see themselves not as passive inhabitants of a world created by God for mysterious purposes, but as active agents capable of reshaping their environment to serve human needs. This sense of human power over nature would eventually justify the exploration and colonization of other continents, but for now, it manifested in more modest projects, like draining marshes and clearing forests. The transformation of European society was accelerating, driven by the momentum of changes that had begun in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death. Each successful innovation encouraged further experimentation. Each person who rose above their birth circumstances inspired others to attempt similar advancement. Each community that prospered through adaptation attracted imitators who wanted to share in that success. By the 1450s, less than a century after the plague had seemed to end European civilization, a new world was emerging that would have been unrecognizable to medieval observers. It wasn't just that people were wealthier or more mobile, though both were true. It was that they had developed fundamentally different expectations about what life could offer and what they could achieve through their own efforts. The foundations had been laid for everything that would follow: the Renaissance explosion of art and learning, the age of exploration that would carry European influence across the globe, the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding of the natural world, and the political revolutions that would create modern democratic societies. But those grand historical developments grew from the simple, practical decisions made by plague survivors who had refused to accept that catastrophe meant defeat. They had looked at their broken world and decided to rebuild it better than before. In doing so, they had created something unprecedented in human history. A society based on the belief that progress was possible, that human effort could triumph over circumstance, and that tomorrow could be better than today. That belief would drive European development for centuries and ultimately reshape the entire world. But the most remarkable thing about this transformation was how ordinary it had seemed to those who lived through it. They hadn't set out to create a new civilization or launch a new historical era. They had simply tried to survive, to provide for their families, to build communities where life was possible and hopefully pleasant. Their practical adaptations to immediate challenges had accumulated into changes more profound than any conquest or revolution. The Black Death had tried to end their world. Instead, they had used its disruption as an opportunity to build something better, and they were just getting started. The ripple effects of this transformation were about to crash into one of Europe's most sacred institutions in ways that would shake the continent to its core. By the 1450s, the Catholic Church found itself facing a crisis that made the plague years look simple by comparison. At least during the Black Death, the enemy had been visible. Now the threat came from something far more dangerous. Questions. Picture walking into a village church on a Sunday morning in 1460. The building itself might look familiar: stone walls reaching toward heaven, stained glass filtering coloured light across wooden pews. But listen carefully to what's happening inside, and you'll hear something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The congregation isn't just passively receiving the priest's Latin sermon. They're whispering among themselves, comparing what they're hearing to what they've read in their own vernacular Bibles, asking pointed questions about indulgences and papal authority. This wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was something more subtle and ultimately more dangerous: intellectual independence. The same literacy boom that had transformed commerce and governance was now turning ordinary Christians into amateur theologians. And many of them didn't like what they were discovering about their church's teachings and practices. The timing couldn't have been worse for church authorities. Just as lay Christians were gaining the tools to examine religious doctrine for themselves, the church was displaying levels of corruption and worldliness that would have made medieval reformers weep. Pope after pope lived like Renaissance princes, more concerned with artistic patronage and political maneuvering than spiritual guidance. Cardinals accumulated multiple bishoprics like investment properties, rarely visiting the dioceses they supposedly shepherded. But it was the sale of indulgences that really opened the floodgates of criticism. The church's claim that salvation could be purchased with coins struck many people as fundamentally at odds with Christian teaching. When a peasant who had worked his way up to modest prosperity through honest labor watched a wealthy merchant buy his way out of purgatory, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The printing press turned what might have been isolated grumbling into a continental conversation. Pamphlets criticizing church practices circulated through the same merchant networks that carried spices and silk. Anonymous satirical poems mocked papal pretensions in language that ordinary people could understand and appreciate. Even visual propaganda began appearing, woodcut illustrations showing fat priests counting coins while poor Christians prayed in vain. University-educated reformers like Jan Hus in Bohemia and John Wycliffe in England provided intellectual frameworks for popular discontent. Their writings, translated into vernacular languages and mass-produced by printing presses, gave ordinary Christians sophisticated arguments against practices they had always found troubling. When a village blacksmith could quote Wycliffe's arguments about papal authority, the church's monopoly on religious interpretation was effectively broken. The church's response was predictably heavy-handed. Reformers were burned as heretics. Books were banned and confiscated. Inquisitors travelled from region to region, investigating suspected deviations from orthodox teaching. But these measures, which might have been effective in the medieval period, proved counterproductive in the new information environment. Every martyred reformer became a hero to his followers. Every banned book became more valuable and sought after. Every act of persecution provided fresh evidence that the church hierarchy cared more about maintaining power than serving God. The harder church authorities pushed, the more resistance they generated. By the early 1500s, religious dissent had become so widespread that it was impossible to suppress through traditional means. Entire regions were effectively in spiritual rebellion, maintaining the forms of Catholic worship while privately embracing Reformed theology. The stage was set for the explosive confrontation that would fracture European Christianity forever. Meanwhile, the economic transformation that had begun after the plague was reaching new levels of sophistication and complexity. The simple market relationships of the 1300s had evolved into intricate financial networks that spanned continents and involved thousands of participants. European merchants weren't just trading goods anymore. They were trading in futures, currencies, and abstract financial instruments that would have baffled their medieval ancestors. The Medici Bank, which had started as a modest Florentine money-changing operation, had grown into an international financial empire with branches from London to Constantinople. Their innovations in accounting, credit, and risk management were being copied and improved by competitors across Europe. Banking was becoming a profession requiring specialized knowledge and skills, not just inherited connections and family wealth. This financial sophistication was making possible ventures that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. When Christopher Columbus approached potential investors with his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, he wasn't talking to feudal lords who might fund an expedition out of personal whim. He was dealing with hard-headed businessmen who demanded detailed projections of costs, risks, and potential returns. The fact that Columbus eventually found backing says something important about European attitudes toward risk and innovation by the late 1400s. These weren't desperate gamblers throwing money at wild schemes. They were calculating investors who had learned to balance potential rewards against likely losses, and they had decided that the potential profits from a Western route to Asian markets justified the substantial risks involved. The same calculating approach was being applied to manufacturing, agriculture, and even warfare. European producers were becoming obsessed with efficiency, constantly seeking ways to increase output while reducing costs. Water-powered mills were being improved and expanded. New techniques for processing wool, metals, and other materials were being developed and refined through systematic experimentation. Agricultural productivity was increasing as well, though more slowly than in other sectors. The three-field system that had dominated medieval farming was giving way to more complex rotations that could support larger populations while maintaining soil fertility. New crops introduced from other regions were being tested and adapted to European growing conditions. Even livestock breeding was becoming more scientific as farmers learned to select for specific traits rather than simply accepting whatever animals they could afford. These improvements in agricultural productivity were crucial because they freed up labor for other activities. As fewer people were needed to produce food, more could engage in manufacturing, trade, and services. The demographic recovery from the plague was being accompanied by a fundamental shift in how Europeans organized their economic activities. Urban populations were growing faster than rural ones, as people migrated to cities in search of opportunities that didn't exist in agricultural communities. These new urban residents weren't just seeking survival, they were pursuing advancement, looking for chances to improve their circumstances through skill, effort, and strategic thinking. The cities they found were unlike anything Europe had seen before. Medieval towns had been primarily administrative and religious centers, places where rural people came occasionally to trade or attend religious festivals. But the new cities were economic engines in their own right, generating wealth through manufacturing, finance, and commerce, rather than simply redistributing agricultural surplus. These urban centers developed their own cultures, distinct from both the court culture of the nobility and the folk traditions of rural communities. City dwellers developed different values, different styles of dress and behavior, different ways of thinking about time and relationships. They were more individualistic, more competitive, more focused on material success and social mobility. The psychological impact of urban life was profound. People who lived in cities were constantly exposed to diversity, change, and opportunity in ways that rural residents rarely experienced. They had to learn to navigate complex social relationships with strangers, to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, to compete for resources and recognition in impersonal markets. This urban experience was creating a new type of European personality, more flexible, more ambitious, more willing to take risks and challenge authority. These urban Europeans would provide much of the energy and leadership for the great transformations of the following centuries, from the Renaissance to the Age of Exploration to the Scientific Revolution. But the changes weren't limited to cities. Rural areas were being transformed as well, though often in less visible ways. The consolidation of small farms into larger, more efficient operations was creating a class of prosperous commercial farmers who thought about agriculture in business terms rather than just subsistence ones. These farmers were willing to invest in improvements, experiment with new techniques, and produce for distant markets rather than just local consumption. This commercialization of agriculture was having profound social effects. Rural communities that had been relatively egalitarian were becoming more stratified as successful farmers accumulated land and wealth, while others were forced to become wage laborers or migrate to cities. The old peasant culture of shared labor and mutual obligation was giving way to more individualistic and competitive relationships. The environmental consequences of these changes were becoming increasingly visible. Forests were being cleared at unprecedented rates to provide timber for construction, fuel for workshops, and land for agriculture. Rivers were being diverted and polluted by mills and manufacturing operations. Mining was expanding to meet growing demands for metals used in everything from coins to weapons to household goods. Europeans were beginning to reshape their physical environment on a scale that would have been unimaginable in the medieval period. This wasn't yet the massive environmental transformation of the industrial age, but it represented the beginning of a new relationship between humans and nature based on systematic exploitation rather than adaptive coexistence. The psychological impact of this environmental mastery was significant. Europeans began to see themselves not as passive inhabitants of a world created by God for mysterious purposes, but as active agents capable of reshaping their environment to serve human needs. This sense of human power over nature would eventually justify the exploration and colonization of other continents. But for now, it manifested in projects like draining marshes, clearing forests, and rechanneling rivers. The pace of change was accelerating as innovations in one field stimulated developments in others. Improvements in metallurgy made better tools possible, which increased agricultural productivity, which freed up labor for manufacturing, which generated wealth that could be invested in further improvements. Each successful innovation encouraged more experimentation and risk-taking. By the 1490s, European society had developed what we might recognize as the first systematic approach to technological development. Inventors and craftsmen were no longer working in isolation, relying on trial and error to make incremental improvements. Instead, they were part of informal networks that shared information, competed for improvements, and built systematically on each other's work. This collaborative approach to innovation was facilitated by the same communication networks that were spreading religious reform and commercial information. Technical knowledge, like religious ideas and market intelligence, could now spread rapidly across vast distances. A metallurgical improvement developed in German workshops could be adopted and refined by craftsmen in Italian cities within months rather than decades. The cumulative effect of all these changes was to create a European civilization that was fundamentally different from its medieval predecessor. It wasn't just that people were wealthier or more mobile, though both were true. It was that they had developed completely different expectations about what life could offer and what they could achieve through their own efforts. The rigid hierarchies and fixed traditions of medieval society were giving way to something more fluid, more dynamic, and ultimately more creative. Social mobility was becoming not just possible, but expected. Innovation was being rewarded rather than discouraged. Individual achievement was being celebrated alongside traditional values of community and religious devotion. This transformation wasn't happening without resistance. Many people found the pace of change unsettling, even threatening. Traditional authorities worked to maintain their privileges and prerogatives. Religious conservatives preached against the dangers of worldly ambition and individual pride. Political leaders struggled to maintain order in societies that were becoming increasingly complex and difficult to control. But the momentum of change had become too powerful to reverse. Each generation found itself living in a world that was significantly different from the one their parents had known. Young people could no longer expect to follow in their ancestors' footsteps, because those footsteps led to places that no longer existed. The psychological impact of this constant change was profound. Europeans were developing what we might call a modern mentality, characterized by optimism about the future, confidence in human ability to solve problems, and willingness to challenge traditional authorities when they failed to deliver promised benefits. This mentality would prove crucial to everything that followed. The great age of European exploration and colonization required people who believed they could master unknown territories and peoples. The scientific revolution required people who were willing to question inherited wisdom and test new theories through systematic observation. The political revolutions that would create modern democratic societies required people who believed they had the right and ability to govern themselves. All of these developments grew from the transformation that had begun in the aftermath of the Black Death, when survivors had looked at their broken world and decided to rebuild it better than before. They had created something unprecedented in human history, a society based on the belief that progress was possible, that human effort could triumph over circumstance, and that tomorrow could be better than today. That belief was about to drive Europeans to achievements that would reshape not just their own continent, but the entire world. The energy unleashed by the post-plague transformation was building toward explosive release in the form of Renaissance culture, global exploration, religious reformation, and scientific revolution. The medieval world was truly dead. The modern world was about to be born. And it had all started with ordinary people making practical decisions about how to survive and prosper in the ruins left by history's greatest catastrophe. They had refused to accept that catastrophe meant defeat. Instead, they had used disruption as opportunity, turning the end of their world into the beginning of ours. The transformation was approaching a critical threshold. Within decades, European explorers would be sailing to unknown continents. European artists would be creating masterpieces that still inspire us today. European scientists would be making discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of the natural world. European reformers would be fracturing the unity of Western Christianity forever. But all of these dramatic developments would grow from the quiet revolution that had been unfolding since the 1350s, when plague survivors had begun the patient work of rebuilding civilization. They had created the conditions that would make all the great achievements of the Renaissance possible. More importantly, they had established the principles and attitudes that would drive European development for centuries to come. The world was about to change in ways that no one could foresee. But the foundations for that change had already been laid by people who had simply refused to accept that the end of their world had to mean the end of hope. In their determination to build something better from the ashes of catastrophe, they had created the launching pad for the modern world. The transformation wasn't just reshaping the grand halls of power or the bustling marketplaces. It was seeping into the most intimate corners of daily existence, changing how people ate, slept, and even dreamed about their futures. Walk into any European household by the 1480s, and you'd witness something that would have baffled medieval observers. Families making long-term plans that extended beyond mere survival. Take food, for instance. The post-plague agricultural revolution had created something unprecedented: choice. Where medieval peasants had subsisted on whatever gruel they could scrape together, their descendants were actually selecting from different options. Markets offered varieties of bread, multiple types of cheese, preserved meats that didn't taste like leather soaked in regret. People were developing preferences, discussing recipes, even experimenting with spices that had once been worth their weight in gold. This wasn't just about nutrition, though that had certainly improved. It was about dignity, about the revolutionary idea that ordinary people deserved to enjoy their meals rather than simply endure them. Cookbooks began appearing, written not for royal kitchens, but for prosperous merchants and successful craftsmen who wanted to elevate their daily dining into something approaching art. The psychological impact of this culinary transformation cannot be overstated. When you can choose what to eat rather than simply grateful for anything edible, you begin to think differently about your place in the world. You start to see yourself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone with agency, someone whose preferences matter. Housing underwent equally dramatic changes. The cramped, smoky hovels of medieval Europe were giving way to structures that reflected both increased prosperity and changing expectations about comfort and privacy. Windows became larger and more common as glass production improved and costs dropped. Chimneys, once luxury items reserved for the wealthy, began appearing in modest homes as people decided that breathing smoke-free air was worth the investment. But perhaps most significantly, houses began to include specialized spaces for different activities. Separate bedrooms allowed for privacy that had been impossible in the one-room dwellings of earlier centuries. Dedicated workshops let craftsmen separate their professional lives from their family spaces. Even storage areas became more sophisticated as people accumulated possessions that would have been unimaginable luxuries to their grandparents. This spatial differentiation reflected deeper changes in how Europeans thought about individual identity and family relationships. Privacy became valued in ways that would have seemed antisocial to medieval communities, where collective living was both necessity and virtue. People began to develop interior lives that were separate from their public roles, creating the psychological space for the kind of individual reflection and creativity that would fuel the Renaissance. The concept of leisure was being revolutionized as well. Medieval culture had recognized only two states, work and religious observance. But post-plague prosperity created something new, free time that could be devoted to purely personal pursuits. People began to read for pleasure rather than just instruction. They played games that had no practical purpose beyond entertainment. They even began to travel for the sheer joy of seeing new places, rather than just commercial or religious necessity. This emergence of recreational activity might seem trivial, but it represented a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood the purpose of human existence. If life could include moments of pure enjoyment, then perhaps earthly existence wasn't just a veil of tears to be endured while awaiting heavenly reward. Maybe human happiness was valuable in itself, worth pursuing and protecting. Music reflected these changing attitudes in fascinating ways. The complex polyphonic compositions of medieval religious music gave way to simpler melodies that ordinary people could sing in their homes and workshops. Folk songs began to celebrate secular themes: love, adventure, social mobility, even gentle mockery of authority figures who took themselves too seriously. Instruments became more accessible as craft techniques improved and costs dropped. A successful baker might own a lute. A prosperous weaver might have a small organ in her home. Music making became a social activity that brought communities together, not for religious purposes, but for the simple pleasure of creating beauty together. Dance, too, evolved from ritual observance to social entertainment. The stately religious processions of medieval festivals were supplemented by more energetic forms that allowed people to express joy, flirtation, and community spirit. Young people could meet potential partners in socially acceptable settings that their great-grandparents would have considered scandalously informal. These cultural shifts were supported by changes in how Europeans organized their time. The rigid schedule of medieval religious observance was being supplemented by more flexible arrangements that accommodated commercial and personal needs. Markets operated on schedules determined by supply and demand rather than traditional religious calendars. Workshops opened and closed based on customer needs rather than canonical hours. Even the calendar itself was becoming more secular. While religious festivals remained important, they were joined by civic celebrations, trade fairs, and seasonal gatherings that served social and economic rather than purely spiritual purposes. Communities began to mark their own local achievements and milestones alongside the universal celebrations of Christianity. This diversification of social rhythms reflected the growing complexity of European society. People were juggling multiple identities and obligations: religious believer, family member, professional craftsman, community citizen, economic actor. Managing these different roles required new skills in time management and social navigation that would have been unnecessary in the simpler world of medieval villages. Women's lives were being transformed in particularly dramatic ways. The demographic catastrophe had created unprecedented opportunities for female economic independence, and many women had seized those opportunities with remarkable success. By the late 1400s, European cities hosted female merchants, craftswomen, and even money lenders who operated their own businesses and controlled their own finances. But the changes went beyond economic opportunity. Women were gaining access to education in numbers that would have been unthinkable in medieval times. Literacy rates among urban women were rising rapidly as families recognized that reading and writing skills were valuable assets regardless of gender. Some women even began to write and publish their own works, adding female voices to conversations that had been exclusively male for centuries. Marriage patterns were evolving as well. The arranged marriages of medieval society were giving way to relationships based on mutual attraction and compatibility. Young people were gaining more say in their own romantic destinies, though family approval remained important. The result was marriages that were more likely to be partnerships between equals rather than economic contracts between families. These changes in gender relationships had ripple effects throughout society. Children, raised by parents who had chosen each other, grew up with different models of human relationships. They saw negotiation rather than domination, cooperation rather than submission. These lessons would influence how they approached not just marriage, but all forms of social and economic collaboration. The transformation of family life was accompanied by changes in how communities handled social problems. Medieval society had relied primarily on religious charity and family obligation to care for the poor, sick, and elderly. But urbanization and social mobility were creating new forms of need that traditional systems couldn't address effectively. European cities began developing more systematic approaches to social welfare. Hospitals became more common and better organized. Orphanages provided care for children whose families had been destroyed by disease or economic disruption. Even systems for caring for the elderly evolved as traditional family structures proved inadequate to handle the needs of increasingly mobile populations. These institutional innovations represented more than just practical problem solving. They reflected a growing recognition that community welfare was everyone's responsibility, not just that of religious authorities or wealthy patrons. Citizens began to see themselves as stakeholders in collective well-being, with both rights to assistance and obligations to contribute to the common good. Legal systems evolved to accommodate these changing social realities. Medieval law had been primarily customary and personal, based on relationships between individuals who knew each other well. But commercial expansion and urban growth required more systematic and impersonal legal frameworks that could handle disputes between strangers. Contract law became more sophisticated as business relationships grew more complex. Property rights were clarified and standardized as real estate markets developed. Even criminal law evolved to address new forms of wrongdoing that emerged from urban life and commercial activity. Courts became more professional and less dependent on personal connections between judges and litigants. These legal innovations might seem dry and technical, but they were crucial to the broader social transformation. Reliable legal systems allowed people to take risks and make long-term commitments with confidence that their investments would be protected. They enabled the complex commercial relationships that were driving economic growth. Most importantly, they established principles of fairness and due process that would eventually evolve into modern concepts of civil rights and democratic governance. The pace of change was creating its own psychological challenges. People who had grown up expecting to follow their parents' life patterns found themselves navigating constantly shifting social and economic landscapes. Traditional sources of guidance and authority often seemed inadequate to address novel situations and opportunities. Some individuals thrived in this environment of constant change, developing skills in adaptation and innovation that served them well throughout their lives. Others found the uncertainty stressful and retreated into rigid adherence to traditional practices and beliefs. Most people fell somewhere in between, selectively embracing changes that seemed beneficial while maintaining connections to familiar customs and values. This tension between innovation and tradition created a dynamic cultural environment where new ideas competed with established practices for social acceptance. The result was a society that was simultaneously more diverse and more conflicted than its medieval predecessor, but also more creative and ultimately more resilient. European intellectuals were beginning to develop new frameworks for understanding these social changes. The concept of progress, almost unknown in medieval thought, began to emerge as people observed that human effort could indeed improve material conditions and social arrangements. This wasn't yet the systematic progressivism of the Enlightenment, but it represented the beginning of a more optimistic understanding of human potential. Educational systems were evolving to prepare young people for this more dynamic world. Schools began teaching practical skills alongside traditional subjects. Mathematical instruction emphasized commercial calculation as much as abstract theory. Language education focused on communication skills needed for trade and diplomacy, rather than just religious scholarship. Even religious education was adapting to new realities. While theological instruction remained important, religious leaders increasingly emphasized practical ethics and moral guidance for navigating complex social and economic relationships. The Christian life was being redefined to accommodate commercial success and social mobility, rather than just spiritual contemplation and charitable service. These educational innovations were creating a generation of Europeans who were more confident, more skilled, and more ambitious than their predecessors. They had been taught that they could shape their own destinies through intelligence and effort. They had been given tools for succeeding in a competitive and changing world. Most importantly, they had absorbed the lesson that innovation and adaptation were virtues rather than threats to social order. The cumulative effect of all these changes was to create a European civilization that was fundamentally different from its medieval predecessor. It wasn't just that people were wealthier or more educated, though both were true. It was that they had developed completely different expectations about what life could offer and what they could achieve through their own efforts. The transformation was approaching a critical threshold where quantitative changes would become qualitative ones. The accumulated improvements in technology, education, social organization, and cultural attitudes were creating conditions for breakthroughs that would reshape not just Europe, but eventually the entire world. Within decades, European explorers would be sailing to previously unknown continents, driven by the same combination of ambition, technical skill, and optimism that had transformed their home societies. European artists would be creating works of unprecedented beauty and sophistication, supported by the wealth and cultural confidence that post-plague recovery had generated. European scientists would be making discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of the natural world, building on the systematic approaches to knowledge that had emerged from practical problem solving. But perhaps most importantly, Europeans were developing the psychological tools and social structures that would enable them to adapt to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. They had learned that catastrophe didn't have to mean defeat, that disruption could become opportunity, that human beings could actively shape their own destinies, rather than simply accepting whatever fate circumstances imposed upon them. The Black Death had tried to end their civilization. Instead, they had used its disruption as a catalyst for creating something better. In the process, they had discovered something revolutionary. The future didn't have to be like the past. Tomorrow could be better than today if people were willing to work, think, and adapt to make it so. That discovery would drive European development for centuries to come, ultimately transforming not just their own continent, but the entire world. The foundations had been laid for the modern age, not through any grand design or heroic gesture, but through millions of individual decisions made by ordinary people who refused to accept that catastrophe had to mean the end of hope. They had looked at their broken world and decided to rebuild it better than before. In doing so, they had created the launching pad for everything that would follow: Renaissance art, global exploration, scientific revolution, religious reformation, and eventually the democratic and industrial societies that would dominate the modern world. The transformation was far from complete, and many challenges lay ahead. But the fundamental shift had occurred. Europeans had learned that they were not passive victims of fate, but active agents who could shape their own destinies. That lesson, forged in the crucible of post-plague recovery, would echo through the centuries and ultimately change everything. The world was about to become a much larger, more complex and more dynamic place. But Europeans were ready for that challenge because they had already proven to themselves that no catastrophe was too great to overcome, no change too dramatic to navigate, no future too ambitious to pursue. They had survived the end of their world and built a better one from its ashes. Now, they were ready to take that same energy and determination to the rest of the planet. The transformation was accelerating beyond anything anyone could have predicted. By the 1490s, something extraordinary was happening in workshops and scriptoriums across Europe. People weren't just copying old manuscripts anymore. They were creating entirely new forms of knowledge. The printing revolution that had begun with Gutenberg was unleashing forces that would have seemed like pure magic to medieval observers. Picture walking into a printer's workshop in Venice around 1495. The air thick with ink fumes and the rhythmic thump of the press. But what's really striking is what's coming off those machines. Not just Bibles and prayer books, but technical manuals, navigation guides, even satirical pamphlets that would have gotten their authors burned at the stake just decades earlier. Knowledge was becoming a commodity, and like all commodities in this new economy, it was subject to supply and demand. The explosion in printed material was creating something unprecedented, an informed public. For the first time in human history, large numbers of ordinary people had access to the same information that had once been the exclusive preserve of monks and nobles. A merchant in Hamburg could read the same treatise on navigation that a scholar in Florence was studying. A craftsman in London could learn techniques that had been developed in workshops hundreds of miles away. This democratization of knowledge was having profound psychological effects. People who had grown up accepting that they would never understand the mysteries of the world suddenly found those mysteries explained in books they could afford to buy. The sense of powerlessness that had characterized medieval life was giving way to something revolutionary. The belief that ordinary people could master complex subjects through study and application. But it wasn't just technical knowledge that was spreading. Political ideas were circulating with unprecedented speed and reach. Treatises on governance, critiques of royal authority, even radical proposals for social reform were finding audiences far beyond their authors' original intentions. The printing press was creating the first truly mass media, and with it, the first real public opinion. Religious authorities were among the first to recognize the danger this represented to traditional power structures. When any village blacksmith could own a Bible in his native language and form his own interpretations of Scripture, the Church's monopoly on religious truth was effectively broken. Papal decrees and episcopal letters competed with Reformed theology and mystical writings for the attention of increasingly sophisticated readers. The response was predictable, but ultimately futile. Censorship lists grew longer and more detailed. Inquisitors expanded their investigations to include not just heretical beliefs, but possession of prohibited books. Some regions even attempted to license printing presses and control what could be published. But trying to control the flow of information in the age of printing was like trying to dam a river with a fishing net. Meanwhile, the economic transformation was reaching levels of complexity that would have overwhelmed medieval administrative systems. European merchants weren't just trading goods anymore. They were creating sophisticated financial instruments that allowed for investment, insurance, and credit arrangements spanning continents and decades. The simple barter relationships of the feudal economy had evolved into market mechanisms that operated according to mathematical principles rather than personal relationships. Banking houses like the Medici had developed techniques for managing risk and calculating profit that were centuries ahead of their time. Double-entry bookkeeping allowed for precise tracking of complex transactions. Letters of credit made long-distance trade possible without physically transporting precious metals. Even insurance policies were becoming common as merchants learned to pool risks rather than bearing them individually. These financial innovations were making possible ventures that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations. When Portuguese navigators began planning voyages around the African coast to reach the spice markets of Asia, they weren't relying on royal patronage alone. They were tapping into sophisticated networks of investors who could calculate potential returns and spread risks across multiple expeditions. The same calculating approach was being applied to manufacturing. European producers were becoming obsessed with efficiency and quality control in ways that presaged industrial methods. Textile production was being systematized through division of labor and standardized processes. Metalworking was advancing through systematic experimentation with different alloys and techniques. Even agriculture was becoming more scientific as farmers learned to optimize crop yields through careful attention to soil conditions and weather patterns. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what we might recognize as the first research and development culture. Inventors and scholars were no longer working in isolation, jealously guarding their discoveries. Instead, they were participating in informal networks that shared information, competed for improvements, and built systematically on each other's work. Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps the most famous example of this new type of thinker, embodied the integration of art, science, and technology that was becoming characteristic of European culture. His notebooks contain not just artistic sketches, but engineering diagrams, anatomical studies, and scientific observations that reflected a systematic approach to understanding the natural world. He wasn't just a gifted individual, but a product of a society that had learned to value curiosity and innovation. The pace of technological advancement was accelerating as innovations in one field stimulated developments in others. Improvements in metallurgy made better navigation instruments possible. Advances in optics led to more accurate maps and charts. Even seemingly unrelated fields like architecture and astronomy were cross-pollinating in ways that generated unexpected breakthroughs. European cities were becoming centers of innovation in ways that would have been impossible under medieval social structures. The concentration of skilled craftsmen, wealthy merchants, and educated clergy in urban environments created conditions for rapid exchange of ideas and techniques. Competition between cities for commercial advantage drove continuous improvement and experimentation. But the changes weren't limited to technical fields. European culture was developing new forms of artistic expression that reflected the confidence and ambition of post-plague society. Painting was moving beyond religious themes to celebrate secular achievements and individual personality. Architecture was becoming more concerned with beauty and comfort than just defensive capability. Even literature was expanding to include themes of personal advancement and social mobility that would have been unthinkable in medieval romances. The Renaissance, which was just beginning to flower in Italian cities, represented the culmination of trends that had been building since the plague recovery. The revival of classical learning wasn't just nostalgic antiquarianism, but a systematic effort to recover and improve upon the achievements of the past. Humanist scholars weren't just copying ancient texts, but using them as foundations for new discoveries and insights. This cultural flowering was supported by the same economic prosperity that was funding exploration and technological development. Wealthy merchants and bankers competed with traditional nobility to patronize artists and scholars. The result was an explosion of creativity that produced works of lasting beauty and significance, while also advancing human knowledge and understanding. Educational systems were evolving to prepare young people for this more dynamic and competitive world. Universities were expanding their curricula beyond theology and law to include subjects like mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages. Even primary education was becoming more practical and worldly, as communities recognized that their children would need different skills than their parents had possessed. The concept of professional education was emerging as specialized knowledge became increasingly valuable in the marketplace. Medical schools were beginning to emphasize practical training alongside theoretical study. Legal education was adapting to serve the needs of commercial society rather than just ecclesiastical courts. Even military education was becoming more systematic as warfare evolved beyond simple feudal levy systems. But perhaps the most important educational development was the spread of literacy beyond the traditional learned classes. Merchants needed to read contracts and keep accounts. Craftsmen benefited from access to technical manuals and pattern books, Even farmers were discovering that written records of weather, crop yields, and soil conditions could improve their productivity and profitability. This expansion of literacy was creating new forms of social and political consciousness. People who could read were less dependent on traditional authorities for information and interpretation. They could form their own opinions about political and religious questions based on direct access to source materials. The result was a more questioning and skeptical public that was less willing to accept traditional justifications for social hierarchy and political authority. The implications of this transformation were becoming apparent in the growing frequency of popular uprisings and reform movements. The Peasants' War in Germany, the urban rebellions in the Netherlands, even the continuing religious ferment in Bohemia and England all reflected the same underlying dynamic. Ordinary people who had gained confidence in their own judgment and capabilities were increasingly unwilling to accept traditional forms of domination. Political authorities were struggling to adapt to these new realities. The feudal system that had dominated medieval Europe was clearly obsolete, but no clear alternative had yet emerged. Some rulers attempted to modernize by centralizing power and creating more efficient administrative systems. Others tried to preserve traditional arrangements through increased repression and control. Most muddled through with combinations of both approaches. The more successful rulers were those who learned to work with the new social forces rather than against them. They allied themselves with merchant classes, reformed legal systems to serve commercial needs, and invested in infrastructure projects that facilitated trade and communication. In return, they gained access to new sources of revenue and political support that made them less dependent on traditional feudal obligations. But even the most adaptable monarchs were operating within constraints that would have been unimaginable to their medieval predecessors. Public opinion, while still primitive by modern standards, was becoming a factor that rulers ignored at their peril. The printing press and expanding literacy meant that royal policies were subject to scrutiny and criticism in ways that traditional censorship could no longer effectively control. The Church was facing even more severe challenges to its traditional authority. The same forces that were transforming secular society were undermining the foundations of religious power. When ordinary Christians could read Scripture for themselves and form their own interpretations, when alternative forms of spirituality were readily available in printed form, when competing religious authorities offered different paths to salvation, the Catholic Church's claim to exclusive religious truth became increasingly difficult to maintain. Reform movements that had been successfully suppressed in the medieval period were finding new life in the changed conditions of the late 1400s. The writings of earlier reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus were being reprinted and widely distributed. New reformers were emerging who combined theological sophistication with popular appeal and political savvy. The stage was being set for the religious upheaval that would fracture European Christianity in the following century. Environmental changes were becoming visible as well. The population recovery from the plague, combined with improved agricultural techniques and expanded trade, was putting new pressures on natural resources. Forests were being cleared at unprecedented rates to provide timber for construction, fuel for workshops, and land for cultivation. Rivers and harbours were being modified to accommodate increased shipping traffic. Mining operations were expanding to meet growing demands for metals. Europeans were beginning to reshape their physical environment on a scale that would have been unimaginable in the medieval period. This wasn't yet the massive environmental transformation of the industrial age, but it represented the beginning of a new relationship between humans and nature based on systematic exploitation rather than adaptive coexistence. The psychological impact of this environmental mastery was significant. Europeans were developing unprecedented confidence in their ability to control and modify the natural world to serve human purposes. This sense of mastery over nature would eventually justify projects like draining marshes, redirecting rivers, and even attempting to control weather patterns through various folk and pseudo-scientific methods. But the most profound change was in European attitudes toward the future. Medieval culture had been fundamentally pessimistic, viewing history as decline from some past golden age toward an inevitable apocalypse. Post-plague culture was increasingly optimistic, seeing history as potential progress toward better conditions through human effort and intelligence. This shift toward future orientation was revolutionary in its implications. When people believe that tomorrow can be better than today, they behave differently. They invest in improvements that may not pay off for years. They educate their children for roles that don't yet exist. They take risks based on calculated assessments of potential rewards, rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances they inherit. Young people, in particular, were embracing this new outlook with enthusiasm. Rather than expecting to follow in their parents' footsteps, they began to envision different and better futures for themselves. Social mobility was becoming not just possible, but expected. Innovation was being rewarded rather than discouraged. Individual achievement was being celebrated alongside traditional values of community and religious devotion. The cumulative effect of all these changes was approaching a critical threshold. The improvements in technology, education, social organization, and cultural attitudes were creating conditions for breakthroughs that would transform not just Europe, but eventually the entire world. The energy unleashed by the post-plague recovery was building toward explosive release in forms that no one could fully anticipate. European explorers were already beginning to push beyond the traditional boundaries of the known world. Portuguese navigators were working their way down the African coast, seeking new routes to Asian markets. Spanish expeditions were probing westward into the Atlantic, convinced that they could reach Asia by sailing in the opposite direction from traditional routes. These weren't just commercial ventures, but expressions of the same confidence and ambition that was transforming European society. Scientific investigation was becoming more systematic and empirical. Scholars were moving beyond simply commenting on ancient texts to conducting their own observations and experiments. The tools and techniques were being developed that would eventually make possible the scientific revolution of the following centuries. Artistic expression was reaching new levels of sophistication and beauty. The integration of classical learning with contemporary techniques was producing works that surpassed anything created since the fall of Rome. More importantly, European artists were developing new ways of seeing and representing the world that reflected the changed consciousness of their society. Religious reform was building toward the confrontation that would shatter the unity of Western Christianity. The combination of theological criticism, political resistance, and popular discontent was creating pressures that traditional church authority could no longer contain or control. All of these developments were interconnected, each reinforcing and accelerating the others. The same prosperity that funded artistic patronage also made possible scientific research and geographical exploration. The same literacy that enabled religious reform also facilitated technological innovation and commercial expansion. The same optimism that drove individual advancement also justified collective projects of unprecedented ambition and scope. The transformation that had begun with plague survivors simply trying to rebuild their shattered communities had evolved into something far grander. The creation of a new form of human civilization based on principles of progress, innovation, and individual agency. Europeans had learned that they were not passive victims of fate, but active agents capable of shaping their own destinies and improving their conditions through intelligence, effort, and cooperation. That lesson would drive everything that followed. Within decades, European influence would begin spreading to every inhabited continent. European ideas about science, politics, economics, and religion would begin reshaping societies around the world. The modern global civilization would begin to emerge, not through any grand design, but through the accumulated effects of millions of individual decisions made by people who had learned to believe that better futures were possible. The Black Death had tried to end European civilization. Instead, It had catalyzed the transformation of that civilization into something unprecedented in human history. A society based on the revolutionary premise that human beings could actively improve their world, rather than simply accepting whatever conditions they inherited. That premise would prove to be one of the most powerful ideas ever conceived, driving changes that would ultimately transform the entire planet. The foundations had been laid. The momentum had been established. The tools had been developed. The confidence had been built. Everything was ready for the next phase of the transformation, the explosion outward that would carry European influence and ideas to the ends of the earth, creating the first truly global civilization in human history. But that expansion was still in the future. For now, what mattered was understanding how completely the world had already changed. In less than 150 years, European society had been transformed from a collection of isolated, tradition-bound communities into a dynamic network of cities, regions, and nations connected by trade, communication, and shared cultural developments. People who had survived the greatest catastrophe in recorded history had used that experience not as an excuse for despair, but as motivation for creating something better. They had looked at their broken world and decided that breakdown could become breakthrough, that endings could become beginnings, that the future could be brighter than the past. In doing so, they had created the psychological and social foundations for the modern world. The rest, as they say, would be history. But even as Europeans were reshaping their world with unprecedented confidence and ambition, something else was stirring in the shadows of their success. The very prosperity and mobility that had lifted so many people from medieval poverty was creating new forms of anxiety, new questions about identity and belonging that their ancestors had never needed to confront. Walk through any major European city in the 1490s and you'd witness a curious paradox. On one hand, there was more wealth, more opportunity, more individual freedom than ever before, but there was also something harder to define, a restlessness, an undercurrent of uncertainty that ran beneath all the bustling commerce and cultural achievement. People who had escaped the rigid constraints of feudal society discovered that freedom came with its own burdens. When your place in the world wasn't predetermined by birth, when you could actually choose your profession, your spouse, even your place of residence, the weight of those choices could be overwhelming. Medieval peasants had lived hard lives, but at least they'd known exactly who they were and what was expected of them. Now, a blacksmith's son might become a merchant's daughter might marry a minor noble, a peasant family might accumulate enough wealth to buy their own land and hire workers. These success stories were inspiring, but they were also deeply unsettling to a social order that had been built on the assumption that everyone had a fixed place in the cosmic hierarchy. The psychological impact was profound. People began to experience what we might recognize as the first stirrings of modern anxiety about social status and personal identity. If you could rise, you could also fall. If others were advancing, maybe you were falling behind. If traditional markers of worth were becoming meaningless, how did you know if you were succeeding in life? This uncertainty manifested in fascinating ways. Fashion became even more important as people used clothing to signal their aspirations and achievements. Sumptuary laws multiplied as authorities tried desperately to maintain visual distinctions between social classes, but enforcement became increasingly impossible when a successful craftsman could afford better fabric than an impoverished noble. Religious observance, too, became more complex and personal. The simple faith of medieval villages, where everyone attended the same church and heard the same sermons, was giving way to a marketplace of spiritual options. People could choose between different forms of devotion, different interpretations of scripture, different paths to salvation. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Some individuals thrived in this environment of expanded choice and opportunity. They developed what we might call entrepreneurial personalities, comfortable with risk and change, skilled at navigating complex social and economic relationships. These people became the driving force behind the continued transformation of European society. So here we are, centuries later, still living in the world that those plague survivors built. The next time someone tells you that catastrophe means the end, remember the Europeans of the 1350s who looked at their broken civilization and decided to build something better. They didn't just survive history's darkest hour, they used it as the launching pad for the modern age. From their ashes rose everything we recognize today: democracy, capitalism, scientific thinking, individual rights. Not bad for a bunch of people who were just trying to figure out how to get through tomorrow. The Black Death tried to end their story. Instead, they rewrote the entire script.